My brother said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. "She's not here for the briefing, she's here because she got lost on the way to HR." The laughter came fast. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to land. Enough to make my face go warm under the fluorescent lights of the Ottawa Field Operations Center, where I had worked for the past 6 years without a single formal complaint against my name. I didn't say anything. I never did. That's the part nobody understood. Not my mother, not my old supervisor, not the colleagues who'd pull me aside afterward and say, "You should have said something, Vera," as if saying something was the thing that would have changed it. My brother's name is Adrian. He's 3 years older than me, taller by 4 inches, and for as long as I can remember, he has occupied the exact center of our family's attention the way a furnace occupies the center of a house. Everything else in the room just orbits around the heat. He joined the RCMP at 22. Made sergeant faster than average. Our father framed the photograph, Adrian in his red sarge, chest out, chin up, and hung it in the hallway of their house in Nepean, where it still hangs today, next to my school photos that nobody ever framed. I joined 2 years later. Different path. I went through the civilian intelligence stream, eventually landing with the Integrated National Security Enforcement Team, field analyst, then field coordinator, then, quietly, without ceremony, because that's how these things happen, something more than that, something I wasn't allowed to talk about at family dinners. Which meant that at family dinners, I was still just Vera, Adrian's little sister, the one who works at a desk. My father used to say it with a kind of gentle pity, the way you'd describe someone with a chronic but manageable condition. Vera's more of an office person. He didn't mean it cruelly. That was almost worse. The morning my brother made the joke about HR, we were both standing in the same briefing room for the first time in our careers. It was a joint operation, RCMP and INSET, a cross-agency collaboration on something that had been building for 18 months. I had been embedded in the file since the beginning. Adrian had been assigned 6 weeks earlier when the enforcement side escalated. He didn't know that. Nobody had told him, because it wasn't his business to know, and because the file had a classification level that meant most of the people in that room were only seeing pieces of it. I was one of maybe 4 people who had seen the whole picture. But he saw me walk in, and he made the joke, and the room laughed, and I sat down at the table and opened my folder and said nothing. The meeting lead, a deputy commissioner named Walsh, who I had briefed privately the previous Thursday, looked at me once across the table with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then he looked down at his notes and began. "I should tell you about my father, because Adrian didn't build himself. Nobody does. My father was a 30-year veteran of the Ontario Provincial Police, decorated twice, retired at 55 with a handshake and a golf membership in Canada that he used 6 times before his knees gave out. He's a good man in most of the ways that matter. He coached minor hockey. He drove my mother to every chemotherapy appointment in 2019 without being asked. He cried at my university graduation, which surprised me, though I didn't show it. He also spent most of my childhood telling me in small ways and large ones that the world Adrian was heading into was not really built for me. Not because I wasn't smart. He always said I was smart. But smart, in his framing, was something you applied to paperwork, to support roles, to positions that kept you safely behind the glass while the real work happened on the other side. You got a good head, Vera. You'll do well behind the scenes. Behind the scenes. As if that were a compliment. Adrian absorbed all of it without questioning it, the way children absorb everything that's presented to them as simply the way things are. He didn't think of himself as someone who underestimated me. He thought of himself as someone who understood reality. There's a difference in the mind of a person like that, though from the outside it looks identical. The first time my work crossed into genuinely dangerous territory was 3 years into my position at INSET. A network that had been moving money through Vancouver and Calgary into overseas accounts linked to procurement fraud on federal contracts. I spent 11 months on that file. I built the financial mapping that became the backbone of the prosecution. I attended the trial prep sessions. I sat in a room with Crown attorneys and walked them through a web of shell companies so complicated it had its own dedicated whiteboard. My name was not on the press release when the arrests happened. That's normal. That's the job. My father called Adrian to congratulate him on the bust because Adrian's unit had executed one of the warrants. Adrian called me a week later to mention, almost in passing, that Dad was proud of him. He didn't ask what I'd been working on. It didn't occur to him to ask. I had been managing that particular grief for years by then. The specific exhaustion of being invisible to the people who should see you most clearly. You learn to carry it differently over time. You stop expecting them to look, which is its own kind of loss, but also its own kind of freedom. The joint operation that brought Adrian and me into the same briefing room was called, internally, Project Harrow. I can't tell you everything about it, even now. What I can tell you is that it involved a coordinated threat with financial, logistical, and personnel components that crossed 4 provincial jurisdictions. The intelligence work, the part that made the enforcement piece possible, had taken my team 22 months. I was the lead analyst. My code designation on the internal system was Wren. Nobody in that briefing room knew that except Deputy Commissioner Walsh and the 2 CSIS liaisons seated at the far end of the table. Adrian sat 2 seats to my left. He had a paper coffee cup from the Tim Hortons in the lobby. He smelled like the same aftershave he'd been wearing since he was 19. He did not look at me once during the first 40 minutes of the briefing, except to lean slightly toward the sergeant beside him and say something I couldn't hear that made the sergeant smile. I watched the slide deck. I made my notes. When Deputy Commissioner Walsh reached the section on the intelligence architecture, the part that explained how Harrow had been built from the ground up, the sourcing methodology, the analytical framework, he paused. He said, "The coordinator on this file has been running the intelligence side since the beginning. I want to take a moment before we go further to acknowledge that the operational integrity of everything you've seen this morning exists because of one person's work." He looked at me. Not toward me. Directly at me. "Vera," he said, "do you want to walk them through the source map yourself, or should I?" The room shifted. I felt it more than saw it. The slight adjustment of posture, the recalibration of attention. People turning to find the face that went with the name. Finding mine. I said, "I'll walk them through it." I stood up. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment. That it felt like the scene at the end of a movie where the music swells and the camera slowly pulls back. It didn't feel like that. It felt like doing my job in front of people who had decided in the first 5 minutes that I didn't have one, which is a different thing entirely and harder to explain and more real. I walked them through the source map. I stood at the front of the room for 23 minutes. I explained the financial thread that had taken 4 months to untangle. I explained the personnel network and how we had identified the 2 insider nodes that enforcement hadn't known to look for. I explained the decision point 3 months earlier when the file could have gone sideways and why it didn't. Nobody laughed. Adrian was very still. I noticed that without looking at him directly. I have been noticing my brother without looking at him directly. For 31 years. When I finished, Deputy Commissioner Walsh said, "This is the person who built the foundation you're all standing on today. Everything your units execute in the next 72 hours exists because Wren held this file together for almost 2 years." He paused. "And yes, for those of you doing the math, Wren is also her designation. We don't use it lightly." He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. After the briefing, the room dispersed into the usual controlled chaos of a large operation in its final preparation stages. People clustered in small groups. Phones came out. Somebody propped the door open and a cold draft came in from the hallway, that particular Ottawa November cold that feels like a statement. I was gathering my folders when Adrian appeared at the edge of my peripheral vision. He stood there for a moment, and I let the moment sit, because I had learned a long time ago not to rush toward him. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know." "How long have you been?" "A while." He was quiet. He had the look of someone trying to recalibrate a map that turns out to cover different territory than the one they thought they'd been navigating. I recognized it. I'd seen it on my father's face once, years ago, after I'd corrected something he'd said about the CSIS mandate at a dinner party and turned out to be right in a way he hadn't expected. "The joke," Adrian said, "this morning. It's fine. It's mine. It's mine. It's not, though." I looked at him then. Actually looked at him. He was 41 years old and he had the same face he'd had at 20. just settled more, the lines around his eyes deeper and the jaw a little softer, and he was standing in the posture our father had taught us both. Shoulders back, chin level, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, he looked uncertain. I didn't want to comfort him. I want to be honest about that. The instinct was there, the old reflex of the younger sibling who smooths things over to keep the peace, but I recognized it for what it was and I let it pass without acting on it. I said, "You'll have everything you need for the 72 hours. The briefing package is thorough." He nodded. I picked up my folder. "Vera," he said. I stopped. "You good at this?" he said. "I mean, genuinely." I didn't know. I thought about all the years of family dinners, the framed photograph in the hallway, my father's voice saying she's more of an office person in a tone that meant well and missed everything. I thought about the room full of people laughing at a joke made at my expense by someone who shared my last name. I thought about 22 months of work that had no press release attached to it, no ceremony, no frame on anybody's wall. I thought about how long I had been good at this without anyone in my family knowing. And I thought, not for the first time, about the difference between being known and being seen. "I know," I said, and I walked out. The operation concluded successfully over the following 3 days. I won't give you the details because the details aren't mine to give. What I will tell you is that every node in the network we'd mapped was identified and addressed. The integrity of the case held. My name was not in the news. That was expected. That was right. What was not expected, what I did not see coming, even after everything, was the phone call from my father on a Thursday evening 2 weeks after Harrow closed. He called my cell, which he almost never did. He usually called the landline I'd had since 2018, the one I almost never answered. He said, "I spoke to Adrian." I waited. He told me about the operation, not the details, just what you did, what your role was. "Okay," I said. There was a pause. My father has never been comfortable with silence, so the pause told me something. "I didn't understand," he said, "what you were doing over there, all these years. I don't know what I thought, that it was more administrative, that it was support," I said. "You thought it was support?" "Yes." I was sitting at my kitchen table in my apartment in Centretown. Outside the window, the lights of the street were coming on. The temperature had dropped and people on the sidewalk below were walking with their collars up. That particular November hunch that everyone in Ottawa develops by the first week of the month. "Dad," I said, "I've been doing this for 11 years. I know. I wasn't hiding it from you. There were things I couldn't talk about. But the broad shape of it was always there to see." He didn't say anything. "I love you," I said. "And I understand that the picture on the wall is of Adrian. I understand why, but I need you to know that I have never once done this work to put a picture on someone's wall." "Then why?" he said, not challenging, genuinely asking. My father asking a genuine question is rarer than most people would think. I thought about it for a real moment, not the rehearsed answer, the actual one. "Because it matters," I said, "and because I'm good at it, and because those two things together are enough." He cleared his throat, which is the closest he gets to admitting emotion over the phone. "Your mother wants you to come for dinner Sunday," he said. "I'll come Sunday," I said. I didn't need the framed photograph. I didn't need the press release or the public moment, or the dramatic confrontation that resolves everything cleanly in the final reel. I needed, for exactly one morning in a briefing room in Ottawa, to stand in front of a group of people who had already decided what I was and let the truth of what I'd built speak without my voice behind it. That was enough. More than enough. I've never been interested in revenge the way people expect. What I've always wanted is simpler and harder to explain. I wanted to be seen clearly, by people who'd convinced themselves the view didn't require adjustment. I wanted the record to be accurate. I wanted, just once, for the room to go quiet, not because I'd done something surprising, but because they finally understood that nothing about it should have been a surprise at all. On Sunday, I drove to Nepean. I parked in the same spot I always park in. I went inside and hung up my coat, and my mother handed me a glass of wine, and the house smelled like roast chicken, and my father came out of the living room, and he looked at me differently. Not like I'd changed, like he'd finally looked. I'll take it.